off script here. I hope it's okay with you. But part of the mission of the school from the beginning was to be as generous as possible with financial aid.
Right.
You've told a story about Sandy Greaves giving away tuition. Would you tell that story, and would you tell why that's important that we always make room for students who can't afford to be here?
The second year, when we had 57 students, and half of them really shouldn't have been accepted, that was the year from hell. I don't think we've ever had another year, to thank God, to surpass that one. We had told Miss Greaves that she could give out, I don't remember, $3,500, I think, in financial aid. We didn't have the money. We didn't have it the first year, and we had several students who came for nothing because we were going to have to make up the difference and pay a decent wage anyway. So if they had 3 students or they had 5 students, we were still going to have to make up the difference. So we gave her $3,500, I think, which was a lot compared to our tuition, and said, this is what you can use for financial aid. Well, in that summer around July, I went in one day and she said, y'all are going to kill me. She said, we had a student come for an interview. It's a very good student. It's the kind of student we're going to say we're going to want to say was one of our kids. Her father works 3 jobs. They have 5 children. They couldn't afford it, and I gave her financial aid, and I gave her a full ride. And I said, well, I'm not upset about that. I said, now the treasurer might be unhappy about it. It was Margie Foodie. And I said, but we cannot turn away these students based on financial need. If this is who God sends us, we have to provide it. And I left. And shortly after I left, a man came into the school and said, I understand you've just accepted this student, and wrote a check for the full tuition. Said, I've been trying to help this family for years, and wrote a check for the full tuition. And so then Margie Foodie, the treasurer, calls and goes, well, I believe it now. She said you're doing this on faith, and now I believe it. Catholic education historically has always been academically excellent, spiritually sound, but available to a wide range of students. And that's what makes it Catholic education. That's what makes the atmosphere of the student body so wonderful, is it's a cross-section of socioeconomic children who we have to continue to do that. If we don't offer financial aid and don't make it available to these students, we're not a Catholic school. The atmosphere and the dynamics of the school are not the same. And that is something we've got to really work at. So we've got to build an endowment. And that's on the horizon. I mean, that's on the radar screen, something we're working on.
It's still not praying for money.
No. I
Why?
mean, because if we do the will of God, He will provide, and He has.
God's got a lot of money. Okay. Looking back over the 20 years, everything hasn't been perfect. Right? Mistakes have been made.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, by me too, lots of them. Thank you for not firing me. What do you think? What do you think are some of the bigger mistakes, and what have you learned from them? Well,
we had turnover in the headmaster position 7 times in 7 years. That was kind of a mistake. A big mistake. Now, we did learn later that this is very common, especially among startup schools. But what we would do is we were looking for a Catholic headmaster. Obviously, we had to go outside the Greenville community. We would do national search. The top candidate by May, we needed them to start July 1st. We'd offer the job. They'd take the job. It wouldn't work. 7 years of turmoil, of turnover. That's one reason I had to stay in the position I was in, because there had to be some consistency in the leadership to make sure that the mission was not altered. Everybody was trying to make us what they wanted us to be, and we had to stay constant, and we still do, or we'll become something else. But anyway, what we realized we were doing by the 7th year was we were doing it. And the relationship between a headmaster and the board was like a marriage. And the mission had to be at heart in the headmaster. It wasn't really something you could teach them. They had to own it. And that we had to allow God to do this in God's time. So we convened a search committee again. Ms. Greaves stepped in as the interim while we were looking. And we had a full year search. And the committee agreed to pray the rosary daily, that we would find that God would give us the right person. We committed to the fact that if it took more than a year, it took more than a year. If it took 2 years, if it took 3 years, however long it took, that we would let God pick this person and that God would make it obvious to us that it was the right person. And that's what we did. And that's how we got Mr. Kaiser.
In those difficult times, were there times when you thought the school wouldn't make it another year, another month?
Oh yeah. Yeah, Mary Cotter and I would get a phone call almost daily from Greg Hazelden, who was the director of finance, saying we've got problems, and we'd run around like a chicken with our head cut off, and the next day the sun would still rise, and we would still be there, and it was very precarious those first 7 years. We had nothing but faith. We had strong opposition from our own church. We had personal attacks that we saw as the devil, that we were actually doing God's will, and that's why we were standing this. The one thing I had to accept was that if we did God's will, it could be God's will that the school close. God works in mysterious ways, you never know. And as long as we were willing to live in faith and do the will of God, if it was His will that the school closed, then it was God's will. And the one thing I still held on to was what I knew I'd heard. That this was what God wanted us to do, and I felt at peace. That's why I could sleep, was because God was in charge, and if it was His will that the school closed, then it would close.
Yeah. And the church finally recognized the school as a Catholic school.
Right.
And one of the questions that I wanted to ask you was, what have been some of the finest moments? And I'm sure that this is right at the top of the list. So could you talk about how that happened, and then also talk about some other moments that you would look back over these 20 years and say this is a fine moment for St. Joseph Catholic School?
The getting of the recognition.
Yeah.
Okay, that was it wasn't going to happen with Bishop Thompson. By the time he was toward the end of his episcopate, I guess you call it, we were under a sanction from the bishop that no priest could minister to us in any way. They couldn't set foot on campus. We could not have Mass on campus. For 2 years, we bused our students to Elizabeth Ann Seton, $900 a month, so that we had weekly Mass. So it was pretty bad. We got a call from the bishop's secretary. This was Bishop Baker when he came. We had actually appealed to the papal nuncio shortly before Bishop Thompson was retired, and Bishop Baker came in 1990. It was later than 1990. I don't remember the year he came. But anyway, probably 98 when Bishop Baker came. Yeah. Anyway, they called and said, we want to have a meeting. Bishop Baker wants to meet with you about your situation. So May 1st was the date of the meeting, which we thought, this is great. It's the Feast of St. Joseph the Worker. This is going to go great. And the one thing going to Charleston that we decided was top priority was to get the edict lifted. If the priest could just step foot on campus and minister to our students, that would be a success. So we go into this meeting, and all of Bishop Thompson's lieutenants were still sitting there. Dr. Rousey, Monsignor Carter, and Bishop Baker we knew he was a good man. And we started at the meeting very optimistic. And I asked him if he would rescind the edict, and he said, no, I can't. It's a liability issue. And I said, I didn't understand it. I said, Bishop Baker, your priest can go anywhere on the earth and minister, but they can't set foot at St. Joseph's High School. I said, now how do we explain that to our children? I said, it isn't our purpose to drive the children away from the church. It's our purpose to bring them closer. And how do we understand this? And he just kept saying, it's a liability, it's a liability. I've done nothing but pay out since I've been here. And by the end of the meeting, I was like in a fetal position. I was all curled up, and when we walked to the door, he turned around and said, if you want to, call me. So we left, and I went home and cried for 3 days because I knew he was a good person. And it was so wrong. Well, in the meantime, we were interviewing Mr. Kaiser. I don't know if you knew that I was going to tell this story. I did. And in his interview, he made the comment that he could help us with our relations with the diocese. When he left the room, we all burst out laughing. Because we knew that we thought he has no idea. This is the Diocese of Charleston. It is not Pittsburgh. And, he has no clue what we've been through. But the next day when I interviewed him by myself, I said, well, how did you think you could help? He said, well, my school is an independent school sanctioned by the Diocese of Pittsburgh, and I could get the Vicar of Education to write a letter to your bishop telling him I'm an okay guy. And I thought, well, that's probably might help. It won't hurt. And so anyway, we left the meeting May 1st, and Keith came to work July 5th of 2000. And in the meantime, the bishop's office had called and said, we want to meet again. And I told the secretary, I said, we scheduled a meeting for July 12th, but I called back and I said, I need to meet with Bishop Baker by myself. I said, he's heard their side, he's never heard our side. And we want this to work, and I know he wants this to work, but it's not going to work until he hears what we've been through. So they set me up to have lunch with him. And all the guys got to go eat lunch downtown Charleston. I told them when they let me out at the Chancellery, I said, I feel like I'm going in for surgery. And I went to Mass, and we went over to his residence to eat. And I sat down, and my hand was like this. I couldn't eat. And but I did tell him what I wanted to tell him. And on the way up the steps to eat lunch, he started saying, I think we're going to work this out. He said, I've got a letter from, we didn't know if this priest in Pittsburgh had written a letter or not. You didn't know. And Bishop Baker says, I've gotten a letter from this friend of mine from Pittsburgh who tells me there's a man moving to the diocese. His name's Keith something, and I'm going to get him involved. And he said he sent me a copy of their agreement from their independent school, and I said, Bishop Baker, we have just hired a headmaster from Pittsburgh. His name is Keith Kaiser. And he said, what was his school? I said, Aquinas Academy. And he said, I believe he's the one. So that was, he had lunch, and I watched him eat. And anyway, after the lunch, he goes to make copies, and I walked out on the sidewalk, and Keith was walking up with Al Yulee and two of the other board members, Tom Ballacher, from their nice quiet lunch. And I said, he did it. He'd been here a week. And when we walked into the meeting over at the Chancellery, as you go in, you shake hands and introduce yourself. And I walked in time to see Dr. Rousey run over to Monsignor Carter and say, this is the key. He's the one. And Bishop Baker agreed at that meeting to sanction us, to endorse us as a Catholic, independent Catholic school on August 15th of that year. And he came, and we had a huge celebration. And it was one of the highlights. And I did sit there as soon as the whole thing was over, and I thought, if I could die today, this would be my day to die. Because we finally had the sanction. The number one, even above that, the number one thing that I would remember was when the Blessed Sacrament was brought into the campus in October of that year. Y'all excuse me. That was the primary thing. We had been there so much, and how it was coming to us. I think obtaining this campus is one of the highlights. I think every graduation, every baccalaureate mass is beautiful, and I'll never miss them. Of course, the gym and all the accomplishments. Every time I see our students in a play, every time I see them excel in athletics, I'm sitting there trying to hold back tears because it's such a miracle.
You're in wonder in front of what God
exactly.
has done. Yeah. In recent years, you've learned, and some of us have learned, that you're suffering from the same illness that Blessed John Paul II had, Parkinson's disease.
Right.
What is this teaching you?
Well, it's teaching me humility, because I can't put on any makeup. It's hard to put on makeup when you have tremors. But I even when I first heard about it, I wasn't afraid, because I know God's not going to give me more than that.
Then you can handle. Yeah. Okay. Going forward, what are your dreams in front of God? What do you pray for St. Joe's? And at the same time, maybe what do you fear? What do you struggle with?
I fear that we won't stay on the path that we're on eventually. I think we've got to work very hard, because if it gets too easy, you don't pray. And, there's nothing wrong with hardship. It's part of faith, and it keeps you grounded. Everybody prays when they're having a hard time. Nobody prays when it's the good times. I don't want us to sell out. I don't want us to take the easy way. The right way is always the harder way at the time. And you have to be courageous to do that. This school is so remarkable because it is built on faith. And that's the main thing we have to keep, is faith. We can do it without money, because we've done it without money. But we have to maintain our relationship with God and pray for guidance. That's my fear.
And you'll stay.
I'm going to stay on the board.
On the board as long as
I can.
As long as you can. Yeah. And we will commit to praying for you. You're a beautiful woman with a beautiful faith, who has given us so much. And I'm in a state of wonder in front of you and what God has done with St. Joseph's Catholic School. I know this wasn't easy to share today. God love you and thank you for doing it.
Thank you.
Because you've enriched us all.